This episode of the Managing Madrid Podcast is brought to you by Intercontinental San Francisco Hotel. They hosted our podcast in the Bay Area during preseason, and we met a bunch of wonderful Madridistas, and thank you for coming. It was lovely meeting you all. By the way, if you book now at the Intercontinental, you can get parking and internet in a package. Special savings for you. Drive to their San Francisco hotel. You can combine two of their most popular offers with parking and high-speed internet included in their special rate. Book now directly on their website. And a really great shout out to Intercontinental. They hooked us up, and it's a great location. We walked to the stadium and back, did our podcast there. It was awesome. Coming up is a podcast on Real Madrid's transfer strategy. Some would joke lack thereof, but Jose Perez and I, we kind of discuss why Real Madrid have been a bit more pragmatic and conservative in the last few years, and if that is paying off for them or not, and what it means for the future, and kind of going back also to the Mourinho era and before that, and what it was then and what it is now. So we break that down. Hope you'll enjoy it. I think you will. It's a nice discussion with Jose, as it always is with him. So enjoy it, and as always, we're going to get started with the voices of Ray Hudson and Derek Ray to set us up, and let's go.
Nice article in the Managing Madrid blog. Wonderful lads that do a great job there, and worth reading about that man there. Karim Benzema needs to rest, and the numbers reveal why.
Times ended up almost looking like a 6-3-1. Some very good writing about that on the Managing Madrid website. First-rate podcast as well. Of course, Perez Valverde was a huge part of the equation.
Hello and welcome to a Friday edition of the Managing Madrid Podcast. I am your host, Kiyan Sobhani, and I'm thrilled today to be bringing on Jose Perez, who I've been reading his tweets for, I'd say 2 to 3 weeks now. He's been very active talking about Barcelona's financial situation. He's been very vocal talking about transfers and chiming in on this player and that player. And this was long overdue because I don't like to just read Jose's tweets. I like to actually converse with him on a podcast. So it's nice to have Jose back. Jose, of course, is also in between all of these analysis, is going to PSV games regularly also and dissecting Ruud van Nistelrooy's tactics and whatnot. So, Jose, welcome back to the show. How are you?
All right. Thanks for having me, Kiyan. Yep, it's always nice to be back and talking about Real Madrid. I think I've done enough, talking crap about Barca finances, at least for now, because the subject gets a bit at a certain point, you feel that you end up going in cycles.
Yes.
With Barca fans. It's and they're never going to understand my point. I'm not going to understand their point. And it's okay, let's just agree to disagree.
Yeah.
It is funny because it's when you look at the transfer dealings, sometimes it feels like Real Madrid is the club in financial trouble because they are the ones who are making the conservative decisions. So it is amusing to see that. And sometimes, of course, from the perspective of Real Madrid fans, it becomes a bit frustrating to think it's the club has the money. Why is the club so conservative in the way when it comes to player transfers? So it seems like over the last 3 years or so, the club has gotten particularly conservative and picky about who it wants to sign.
Which is a great segue to exactly what we're going to be talking about today for the next 20 minutes or so. So, it's funny because the conservatism side of things is not something we're necessarily used to as Real Madrid fans. It really depends on what era you grew up in, I suppose. For me, it was 98, so it was a period of financial turmoil that Lorenzo Sanz had put us in. A great president, but didn't necessarily have a grapple on the financial side of things. And so we brought in some players. We also had an exodus of players in 98. We had to sell a bunch of players who helped us win the Champions League the year or two before. And when Lorenzo Sanz came in when Florentino Perez came in, he started to do these big splashes and making these financial moves and stuff. And then so obviously we've been treated to the 2009 Galactico era as well. And since then, I would say in the last few years this has changed, right, Jose, a little bit. And it's interesting because a lot of fans, I think, it's one thing if you followed up this conservative transfer strategy of the past few years, being frugal with your signings. And it's a little bit, look, to be quite honest, it's not entirely frugal. I think if you add up all the tallies of the Jovic's, the Hazards, the Militao, the Vinicius's, the Rodrigos, the Tchouaménis, it actually does add up quite a bit. But relatively speaking, not only to our own history, but also towards what other clubs are doing in the transfer market, it's pretty tame. But I think if you actually followed up this conservatism with lack of silverware, it would be one thing that for fans to get angry about. But this has just been a dynasty that just doesn't end. It's just being stretched from La Decima, and it keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. So it seems to have been panned out from a success point of view anyway. But so where do you want to start, Jose? Do you want how far do you want to go back just as a launching pad?
I think as a launching pad, I just want to look a bit about the evolution of Real Madrid's transfer policy over the last decade. So basically Florentino Perez's second tenure, because it's still interesting to see a bit the evolution there. Like when he comes in 2009 with still of a similar mindset as before of the good old virtuous cycle of keep buying the best players and trying to reap the rewards out of that in all senses, financial, sporting wise, which by the way, that kind of virtuous cycle that Florentino advocated for is similar to the one that Laporta advocates for now, or as he did also in his previous tenure. So they started with that. Of course, they had to face. It would have gone well if it weren't for the fact that they had to face the best Barcelona in history, and that required the club to make a particularly interesting sacrifice, which is this has always been a players over system club, players over coach. And for about 3 years, they really handed the club to Mourinho, who was going to be the one who had control over transfer decisions, over the players. I think it's a pretty Mourinho is a pretty unique phenomenon, because it was the first time in a while where the club really gave that much control to a single coach. That of course affected the transfer dealings of the club, because of course the signings were what Mourinho was looking for, and then afterwards the club starts doing adapting a bit its transfer strategy, where it goes into some of them were interesting bets on the you can start seeing how we move towards the transfer strategy that the club has now, which is they start doing some interesting bets on the future, like the signing of Rafa Varane, like the signing of Isco, taking advantage of certain good market opportunities like Toni Kroos. You can start seeing those details, but still they splashed out on certain players. Like there was still the splashing on James Rodriguez. There was still, when it was not necessary that summer, when you already had Di Maria, the signing of Gareth Bale, which was very useful, but still, it's more it's almost as if the club is a lot more conservative about doing those superstar signings now. And then after 2016, 2017, well, they accumulated so many players over say 2013 to 2016 that they end up with that monster squad that Zidane got for the 2016-2017 season, which again was one of the greatest squads I have ever seen in my life, in the sense that you could put two 11s that could have perfectly challenged for top 3 in La Liga. And from then on, the club has just ramped down and gotten a lot more conservative in its decisions. The club had then that summer of 2019 where it felt like spending big again, saw that the results of that were very mixed, so somewhere between mixed to negative, and it looks like that confirmed their feelings of okay, we're probably not doing that kind of spending again. And I think that's kind of where the club is at the moment. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of things I'd like to say, and because you touched on a lot of things, and I do think I would be very curious to know, if Mourinho was the coach now, how much our transfer strategy would be different, because he would be a kind of coach who would be much more vocal and I want this, I want this, I want this, whereas Ancelotti seems to be more of a figure who's whatever squad you give me, I'll reinvent some players. I'll make some weird tweaks and I'll make it work, you know? And so I'd be curious to see like what the contrast would be if Mourinho was here, for example. But obviously that ship has long sailed, so that's not going to happen. But Mourinho was always the guy like, I want 2 players deep in each position. And technically speaking, we have that right now. It just depends on, do you consider Mariano a second striker, or do you consider him a non-existent player? Would Mourinho have valued Luka Jovic or not? And I think this is interesting because, like, when you talk about 16-17, for example, that squad and how deep that was, the one thing about 16-17, I said it during that season, and I've been saying it every season since, that is not sustainable to have a team that good, that deep. Like, it's like
never happened.
That was always going to end. It just was, not to say it was going to end good or bad. It's just, it was going to end at some point, because you look at the players who were on the bench. Kovacic is the poster boy of this. Kovacic is not going to be part of Team B forever, you know, and he's just going to want to go and play. And so that was not sustainable necessarily. And if you have it for 1 or 2 years, it's a bit of an anomaly, and ultimately you're going to lose some of your bench players who want to go start elsewhere. I think that the depth we have right now in midfield is an exception to that rule, because the timeline actually works.
Yeah.
The timeline with the Tchouaménis, the Camavingas, etc., works with the timeline of Modric and Kroos being phased out in a year or two, or whatever the years are, right? And there's an expectation set from the start. Like, you're coming in, you're working your way in. They know that, the club knows that, and everyone knows that. So that works, I think. But I think it's one of those things where I think the sporting vision side of things, even though we don't have a sporting director, has been a bit better. It's not to say that the club hasn't made any mistakes. I think there's been plenty of mistakes we've made. Hazard was a mistake in retrospect. Although, in my opinion, like, if we put ourselves in a time machine at that time, I would argue Hazard was a player that would have been very useful if he had been healthy. He was in Chelsea. It was an unbelievable line breaker and creator, and we were desperately needing someone to help Benzema on the offensive side of things. It worked out in a way because Vinicius rose, but I would argue at the time it made sense. There are alternating views to that. I know I remember Ohm being at the time like, he's not going to score goals like Cristiano Ronaldo, so this is not really a replacement. And my view was like, well, nobody's going to score goals like Cristiano Ronaldo. We need one of the best attacking players in the world to help our offense. And Hazard was that at the time, so that didn't work out. And Jovic, you could argue, like, we keep on, like, if you look at Jose, like, all the names we've been linked to this summer that fans are crying about, Sesko, Broja,
there's a bunch of names there.
The whoever's, I'm like, none of these guys are as good now as Jovic was when we signed him from Frankfurt.
Nope.
And so I would argue Jovic at the time was a good signing too, because we were all crying for a backup for Benzema, and Jovic was doing incredible things at Frankfurt. And now it's one thing to have that vision in the sporting direction in place. It's another thing to, like, when you bring that player in, will the coach actually use that player like that player? It didn't seem like Zidane or Ancelotti were too enamored with Jovic in the way he played, or whatever it was, the way he carried himself. Maybe it was the lack of ability to do some of the stuff Benzema was doing, or just the sheer fact that Benzema couldn't be dropped. That's a combination of a bunch of things. But I mean, like, so, like, these things are a little bit tough, but, like, how do you think, Jose, that this transfer strategy has panned out? Has it been successful, or should it have been different the last few years?
So, from my perspective, I feel that sometimes the club gets too conservative, as in there are certain, like, there really seems to be like a bit of an all or nothing mentality right now with this transfer policy, in that you either get the very best in their positions. Like, you either get the very best in their positions, or you get nothing, but there's no intermediate. And there is, like, I think there are pros and cons to it. So and I'm gonna make this example by comparing a bit to Barcelona. I think Barcelona did, like, some good operations there, like, for example, taking advantage of the market opportunity for Lewandowski, getting Koundé, who honestly, for a player of his potential, like 50 to 60 million, like, that's actually quite nice. but spending I think what Spanish clubs shouldn't be doing is spending Premier League transfer fees on talent that's good but not great. And by that, I'm thinking about guys like Ferran Torres or Rafinha. To me, those kinds of signings are not...
Careful, the Barca guys, they're going to come out of the forest. They have a sixth sense for these things. They're coming.
And that's kind of the way I see it, that I think clubs, like Spanish clubs, cannot afford to do that. You cannot go and afford and pay like Spurs does, like 60 million for Richarlison. Like you get these players on market opportunities. If you can find one of these, like if these guys are on the last year of their contract and you can get them for cheap or on a free, you get them. But spending Premier League amounts of money on this kind of talent, I don't think is viable for Spanish clubs at the moment, given the difference in income with Premier League clubs and given the financial regulations of the league. Like, it doesn't seem like a sustainable way of doing it. So I do understand in a way why why Real Madrid now is being a bit all or nothing. It's like, if we're going to spend, let's just do it for the very best. And if not, we just take advantage of market opportunities whenever they show up and wait. And meanwhile, wait. But sometimes there are certain things like to give a comparison of a club that's having a surprisingly rational summer. It's PSG that goes and signs like Renato Sanchez for 15 million. Like, it's not going to be like a player that's going to start, but it's a useful squad pickup. Nordi Mukiele from Leipzig, another good pickup for like as a backup right back for like 20 million. Like, those are nice pickups that you can have that are not going to be superstar players, but they're good for the squad building. And I think the club, and I think Real Madrid is avoiding even doing those kinds of signings. And that's my main disagreement. I wish they did at least those like more affordable pickups. I do think that we are in no condition though to spend say 50 to 60 million on a guy who's not going to be like top of the line. That I do agree with.
So you bring up a lot of interesting points, and I agree with a lot of those points you make. I think it is interesting because, so like the market opportunity thing, which has been the transfer strategy of late, which we've discussed, all those market opportunities which we've capitalized on or haven't capitalized on in the past few years. We've already talked about them, so I don't want to get into it again, who those players were. But I do think that even based on our market opportunity philosophy that we have right now, we have made mistakes. We have passed on good market opportunities. You maybe brought up something right there. I think it's important for me to say this too, because I think a lot of people feel like I defend the club too much on everything we do with the transfer market, and that's probably a fair criticism of me. But I also think that there have been instances in the past that I've criticized the club on certain decisions they haven't made, or decisions that they made, I defended them, and I've been wrong about it. So, for example, I remember, which summer was it that Higuain went to Milan? I can't remember. Anyway, it was like a couple years ago or something, right before he went to Inter Miami. And I remember like we were like going through like the list of backup striker options, and because we really felt we needed one for Benzema, and we thought like, well, if Higuain went to Milan for peanuts, why don't we just pick him up, like as a backup and stuff like that? And it turns out like it's fine that the club passed on that opportunity, right? But the one like this summer, for example, that I really think that I didn't really understand. And I guess it goes back to the fact that we, or you and I think are on the same page as this, have a different interpretation of what a good opportunity, good market opportunity is than the club does, right? Like, I thought if you're going for market opportunities, Gnabry was sitting right there and it wasn't too expensive. Leroy Sané, I was a little bit on the fence about, so I'm not going to push that agenda too much. But Gnabry is definitely one. I did not see Rafinha as a market opportunity. No. Who else? Can't remember who else got sold this window. I think you are on the same page on this one. If Bernardo Silva is available, that's missed opportunity. Yes. So,
yes. And to me, Bernardo Silva falls into like a slightly different category in that I think Bernardo, like guys like Tchouaméni, Bernardo, maybe next year, if the club wants to go for Reece James or Jude Bellingham, are like talents of a magnitude that the club is willing to pay whatever. Actually, I don't know if the club, like, I see Bernardo in that category. I don't know if the club sees Bernardo. Like, I have a feeling that Real Madrid will not pay whatever for Bernardo. I would, but that's a different story. So, which is why I have a feeling that even if Bernardo Silva were available right now, I don't think the club would go for him, because it's like,
I don't think so either.
Because it's not in market opportunity. So those are just things where my vision differs a bit from the club. To me, Bernardo is another interesting opportunity, and in my opinion, a player that you should go no matter what. But that's kind of the category. Like, if I look at the targets that the club has right now, is like kind of the Tchouaméni or Mbappé, like the player who is so good that we pay whatever is necessary for it. There's the market opportunity player. And then there are like the young bets that we're going to see that we don't spend that much. Like, it's like the Hendricks, what's the name of this kid that came for right back, Tobias or?
Vinicius Tobias, yeah.
Yes. Those are the kids that we're doing like the smaller bets, and then we see how they pan out. And that seems to be like the three categories of players that the club is targeting at the moment. And I think those are pretty reasonable categories. At this point, the main difference is that, for example, you and I will have with the club is that what we consider a market opportunity or a player that's valuable enough to spend now, like those things, we might have differences of opinion there. But yeah,
and that's probably going to be the case probably for the rest of our lives. And I think the club is pretty scarred on the contracts they've given in the past that have really handcuffed them. The Bale contracts, the Jovic's contract, the Hazard contract, and I think they're just like, they're done. They're done.
Yeah.
They're done with it. They're like, if we're going to give out big contracts, it's going to be to really, really good young players. It's not going to be to someone who's 30 or over or close to it, or someone who's mediocre but not great or doesn't have a great ceiling. I think they're just being really careful about it now because they don't want to be handcuffed anymore. And I think that's understandable. Yeah.
And I think there's a certain piece that I got. Like, I know that Liverpool and Salah ended the speculation pretty early in the summer, but I had a certain piece where I noticed there wasn't any like major rumors of like Salah going to Real Madrid, because I felt like if the club, as good as he is, if the club had really been interested in signing him, it really would have meant that no lessons were learned from Hazard. Like, because it would have been a similar, because that's the thing. Like, I think a lesson that has to be learned for big clubs in general, like the failure with Hazard, the failure Barcelona had with Griezmann, the failure Chelsea had with Lukaku. Signing these four, this is especially important for forwards. Signing a forward for 28 years of age for like 100 million is something no big club should be doing at the moment. Just a gigantic no.
Especially a club that is not desperate to do it, you know.
Yeah.
And actually, I would argue if you're desperate to do it, maybe that's a good time to not to do it as well. So like, look, again, this is if this was a situation where we're missing out on Champions League spots and things are just really bad, things are not working out, there's maybe more of a reason to risk and stuff, or to go the other way and not risk and start promoting and being more patient. I don't know, but patience has been the game. Patience has been the game, and I think I've always erred on that side as well, because you can go gung-ho and blow it up, but if you're going to do that, you got to make sure they fit your sporting project and they're good. And I think,
Yeah. And it's, I think right now, Real Madrid is kind of in a privileged position in terms of patience. It's like Barcelona cannot afford to be patient because they haven't won the league in 3 years. They see their opponent, their rival keeps winning Champions League somehow. So they feel that pressure. Bayern, for example, can afford to be patient because they have no competition in their local league. Their home crowd, like their local fans, actually, it's a bit like the English club culture where they are not that obsessed about winning Champions League. So they still have pressure to win it, but it's not
until they win it, and then they're going to think it's the most important trophy in the world.
Fair.
Yeah.
So then Real Madrid is in that kind of privileged situation where, and I think like a thread I was reading by journalist Alberto Gea, like really put it like really well. It's like this team is already legendary at this point. Like a lot of people in this team are just playing to just make the history books a bit longer. And that gives the club like a lot of patience to build. Of course, there are pros and cons of the approach. I think one thing that needs to be clear, for example, is that this season, Real Madrid was really just one Vinicius explosion away from an anxiety attack. You don't get a Vinicius breakthrough last season, you probably don't have a double, and we are having an entirely different conversation this summer.
Yep.
But this is also like, that's football. Those are the kind of fine, like, these are the fine margins that apply to football games. And in a way, they also kind of apply to transfer strategy. When you're a club this big, it's like, if Vinicius doesn't explode, then we're having a completely different conversation in terms of transfer strategy. Barcelona needs to have completely different conversations on market strategies because of the pandemic. So it's always kind of changing. So
that's why, and that's why I love talking to you and other people on the Managing Madrid staff, because it's always, for us, it's always been process over results. So like that, the margins of football are so small. Like one bounce the wrong way in the round of 16, we're out versus PSG. You know, one, God forbid, Courtois is injured at some point, and you know Lunin has to save Messi's penalty instead of him. And, like we're out a long time ago, and so these margins can add up. So we're just kind of looking at the process, and if you're able to do it that way and kind of ignore outside noise and pressure and build it that way, it's easier said than done. But that's something I think you always need to do. And I think a lot of the panic was induced by Barcelona's summer in itself. And I think Real Madrid had to just ignore that outside noise and just focus on building their team. So, Jose, I know we're out of time here. You got to go. This was a fun discussion, fun chat. And we'll probably catch up next week at some point. Thanks, Jose. Appreciate it.
Yes. And I mean, I think in the next week or so, there will be a bit of an article on this. Just to give people like a heads up, like this article will be based on a thread from a journalist called Alberto Gea, who the reason I love reading this guy is that like we are usually stuck like in that daily noise of transfer market news. And this guy is really good at just zooming out from that whole mess and just giving you the long-term stuff, the long-term trends. And that is like when you have a news feed that's ultra crowded, you get like the long-term view gets lost, and this guy is good at keeping it there. So that's kind of why I love reading his threads, and I'm trying to translate some of it to English so that we can take this conversation into the English-speaking space. So we're going to have that conversation in the next week. I think even for a future podcast, we can also start talking about what does this transfer policy mean for like the kind of player that Real Madrid looks for? Because I think there's a future conversation that we can have on like why players like Martin Odegaard failed at Real Madrid and say Valverde and Rodrigo haven't. So, but that's a discussion for another time.
It's a great one. I like these. These are good, really good talking points. We'll pencil them in for future podcasts. We got a lot of content we need to put out for the next year or so. So we'll save it. Thanks, Jose. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for listening.
All right, before we wrap it up and send you guys along on your way, we wanted to give a quick shout out to our patrons over on patreon.com/Managing Madrid. Not only do patrons get exclusive access to episodes, but you can also be a guaranteed patron, which means you not only get guaranteed responses to your questions, but you also get a specific shout out on the podcast. So shout out to these $10 plus patrons who do so much to support the show. We got Brandon Alvarez, Willie Reed, Wei Pering, Wamik Jamal, Umar Mahadi, Tyler Simon, Tobias Oriol Botcher, Tarek Goktas, Talib Salhab, Tahmid Kalam, Sujai Wani, Sumanshu Singh, Shivam Tiwari, Sherry Soriol, Sheikh Atiri, Shamil, Shabazz Sharapov, Sergio Arispe, Santos Solorzano, Samuli Justin, Samir Z, Said Mahad, Sai Mohan Sasi Kumar, Rodrigo Balmaceda, Rishi D, Phoenix, Peter Powell, Paulo Fierro, Patrick Odai Fadi, Oscar Barrera, Nico Laxo, Nicholas Zapatero Zubiare, scroll, page 2, Nicholas Molo, Nick Ribeiro, Nelson Mazariego, Muxi Thengol, Mowgli, MJ Diego, Michael Zinberg, Marin Myrtle, Matthew Atkins, Martin Ridman, Logan Stahl, Leon Savernakis, Kunal Tilakar, Crystal Glass, Kevin Rivera, Jose Cruz, John Fernandez, Jeff Thurston, Jason Fitz, Ian Marley, Graham Gerard, Gary Kohut, Frederick Antakiro, Frederick Sundros, Faisal Hamdan, S.A. Davisito, Eloy Enriquez, Edward Sossman, Daniel Williams, Christian Toft, Christian Acosta, Charles Williams, Brendan Powers, Brandon Stevens, Ashik Bashar, Armin Gashi, Armando L. Antons Rudenko, Anirudh Singh, Alexis Ceniceros, Al Azaz Hussein, Adrian Rios, Adar Zalikovic, Adam Dorsey, and Bella Chow, and Barun, and Ramtin Makrur, Fabian Moreno, and Daniel Smith. Love you guys so much. Appreciate you all, and Halamari.